Ja, hej allihop. Johanna Daehli heter jag, kommer från Sekwa förlag där jag är förläggare. Och det här är ingen mindre än Thúy från Montreal. Kim har skrivit 3 böcker som vi har gett ut och nu har den här boken Vi kommit, som kom precis före sommaren, i översättning av Ulla Linton som sitter i publiken. Okay, Kim, you
have a microphone.
Good.
I cannot speak Swedish yet. No. I can only say hey.
Okay.
Yes.
If you know Kim, if you've heard Kim speaking before, you know she doesn't really need a moderator. She's very good at talking on her own. But I just thought I've got 2 questions to start with, and then we just let her go because she's so good at it. I was thinking what really is behind your books, the stories behind, and why you find it so important to tell.
The stories is very similar to my own personal story. It's really about the boat people, the Vietnamese boat people in the 70s and the early 80s when we left Vietnam. And as you know, Vietnam ended, the war in Vietnam ended in 1975. And the North has won against the South, and the North was supported by the Soviet, and so the whole country became communist. And the South, before the war, was supported by the Americans, and so we were basically pushed out of the country. No, not pushed out. We were isolated from the outside world, so there was no more contact at all with the outside world, and you cannot move anywhere, even inside the country. So the only way for us to leave Vietnam was to flee by boat, and if we left, it was because we no longer had access to education or anything. So if you were 18-year-old and you were not admitted to university, you went directly to a battlefield, and as a boy. And I have an uncle who was 17 then, so we had to decide if we stayed or not, because if we stayed, then he would go to a battlefield and die on a battlefield, or we took the chance to go on the ocean and maybe not die. And we were lucky enough, not all of us survived, but we were the lucky ones who survived. And so we arrived in Malaysia as a refugee, and we were also lucky that we didn't meet any pirates, so no stealing, no raping. And in Malaysia we stayed only for 4 months, and we got selected by Canada, and we have been living in Canada for all those years. And we are more than 1 million Vietnamese living outside of Vietnam from this era. And surprisingly enough, there are not many books written about the Vietnamese boat people, because the image that I have is that when you're in the survival mode, you run, and when you run forward, you cannot look backward. And writing is about looking backward, and not backward, but to be able to sit down and think about what has happened, and to have that perspective from the outside and see the whole picture. And it's unfortunate that Vietnam doesn't have its own history, because in Vietnam today there's still a lot of censorship, so you don't have historians who are free to write what they want to write. And so if you want to read about Vietnam, there are more books or documentation in France or in the US. And in Vietnam itself, you do have history books, but they are really from the communist point of view. And this is also why my book cannot exist in Vietnam. It is translated in about 25 countries, but not in Vietnam, and because, there are some publishers who are interested. They contacted us, and then we said, yes, of course, but they said that they will have to cut out all the pages where I talk about boat people. And yes, and when I was a lawyer, I had the chance to go back to Vietnam to work. And I remember that every morning when we got the newspaper called, the International Herald Tribune, we always get it 2 days late. Not because it arrived late. There was a plane that delivered the newspaper, but they have to read all the articles and black out all the parts that were censored. So when you get your newspaper, you see somebody has used a pen to take out the words that we were not allowed to see. And the thing is, they didn't think, because if you put that paper under the light, you still see, what is written. And it was the same thing with the Economist, any documents from outside. Of course, it has changed a lot. In 2016, you had the freedom to read a foreign press, but the Vietnamese culture is still under control of the Communist Party. And I'll give you one example. If you go to bars or clubs in Vietnam, and you have singers who sing in Vietnamese, all the songs had to be approved by the government before they could be sung on stage that night. And so you still have to go through the process for culture. So anyway, so we left, and with my family. So this story is also about this girl who left the country with her family, arriving in Canada, but also have the chance to go back to Vietnam and to live a second cultural shock. So the first cultural shock is in Canada, and the second one is in Vietnam.
But maybe you should say a little bit, because the first novel you wrote, that I think maybe some of you already read, Rue, that was the first. It was 7 years ago, or
6 years ago. Yeah.
And it got a huge audience, and then it's translated all over the place. And why did you actually write it? What made you write it?
I didn't think that I could write a book. It was very accidental. I fell asleep a lot at red lights, and one of the ways for me to stay awake was to take notes. And at the beginning, it was just to-do lists, what to buy at the grocery, what I have to do with the kids. And then one day, there was one light that was really long, and I had finished my to-do list. So I turned the notebook around, and I started just taking notes, and then it became a book without me knowing. It grew by itself. But once that I've written it, many Vietnamese have come up to me, and they say that I have told their stories, and that's where I found the meaning for the book, that I was speaking on behalf of many of the boat people experience. And since then, there are so many stories. When you start digging, not digging, but when you start being labeled at the voice of the boat people during that time, people would come up to you and tell you so many stories, and then you carry all these stories, and each person has a different story, as you could imagine. For example, just the girl who does nail. I don't know if in Sweden most of them are Vietnamese or not, but in Quebec, all of them are Vietnamese. And you know how it started? Because when the first wave of refugees who arrived in the U.S., it was in California. And then there was a reporter from the BBC traveling from the UK to California to interview all these refugees. And apparently one of the women went up to the reporter, and she said, "Your nails are so beautiful, are so perfect." And then this reporter, she was trying to see how she could help the refugees in California. And she said, "Oh, maybe I can send them to nail, how do you say that, school? A place where they teach you how to do nails." And so the first group was just 10 women, 10 Vietnamese women who were interested in learning how to do the nails. And because of those 10 people, now it's all over the world, and you know exactly where it started. And because I hear so many of these stories, and I want to share them with you, and that's why I think I keep on writing. And the story of this nail girl is that because she was Vietnamese, so I took for granted that I knew her story, that I didn't have to to ask. But then one day she asked me about a recipe, a tomato soup recipe. And I said, why do you want that? The soup, it's so simple, you know, it's with parsley and a little bit of fish and fish sauce and lime juice. And she said because, and then she started telling her own story, that she left when she was 9 with her brother who was 11, and they left with only the father, because at that point there were way too many pirates at sea, and all the women got raped all the time, many times during the trip. And so the mother stayed behind, and they left alone. But then they got, because of the wind and the wave, their boat went back to Vietnam, and the father could hear the Vietnamese police. So he knew that they would be caught and sent to prison and so on and so forth. So he said to the children, he said, we are no longer together, because he was hoping that the children would be released first. And so they put them in prison, all of them. And the prison was just, you know, very simple, with chicken wire around, and in the middle there was a metal sheet to separate the men from the women. So the little girl, she was separated from her brother of 11 years old. And she said that she was so scared, of course, to be alone. But during the day, she could stand at one part of the fence where she could see the brother. But at night, they couldn't stay in that part, so they have to be behind the metal sheet. And her brother, in order to accompany his sister, what he did was he dug a hole under the fence so that she could hold her hand during nighttime. And she said that she does not remember what they could eat, because there was not really, you know, food available. But one day somebody gave her just a bowl of that soup, that tomato soup, and she said that it was so good that, you know, she still remembers, and she has been trying to make that same soup over and over again. It never tastes the same now in Canada. And she said that she have used, you know, yellow tomato, pink tomato, purple tomato, all kinds of tomatoes, and it's still not good. And it's, you know, and of course I said to her that it would never taste that good. You have to go back to prison to really love this soup. And that's why I said, but this story is so great, you know, about memory, about how we got stuck with different traumas. And so, yeah, so my books, I guess, is about sharing their stories, and I feel like I have the mission now to do it.
But why do you think they won't share their stories? Why don't the Vietnamese people? Because they'll tell.
Yeah, about the history.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we don't have historians, free historians to write about the history of Vietnam. And I'm not a historian, and I'll never be able to really write history in an objective way. But I said to myself that maybe they can be notes, you know, that we can keep for the next generation, because already my parents are in their 80s. So once that they leave, we lose completely that page of the history of Vietnam, because it's not written anywhere. And yeah, we're not lucky enough to have historians. And like I say, I very often say history is probably the most precious national treasure that a country can have. And I think in Sweden you have many historians, and in Canada as well. And so I don't know when we will have the Vietnamese history being written. Yeah.
So maybe you should just tell us a little bit of the
story?
Of the story, because it's so beautiful. You know, Kim keeps saying, still, after 3 books, that's a big success all around the world, that she's not an author.
No, I'm not an author at all. I love to write. That's the one thing, and I love the words. And the story of V is about, her adapting herself, of course, in Canada, and misunderstanding many of the codes. And the story that I love the most is the big belly, because we thought that big belly was a beautiful sign, that it was a sign of wealth. Whereas I know now, 30 years later, that it's better to not have a belly, right? But my father, when we first arrived in Canada, he really tried to drink beer so that he would have the big belly of the Canadians, right? That it's a sign of wealth. And that's also because of the Buddha, the prosperity Buddha that you see. It's always with the big belly. And if you touch that belly, then you become happy and prosperous and so on and so forth. And so that part, how she adapted herself in a country where there's so much freedom. When you're born in a war zone or in a country like Vietnam under the communists during those first few years, you don't have any freedom. You cannot read, you cannot listen to music, you cannot speak. And you're used to that, you adapt yourself to that situation. And then after that, we were in the refugee camps, and again, your freedom is within, those fences. And you arrive in a country like Canada, and very similar to Sweden, where everything is open. Even the houses are not locked, and the cars are not locked, and everybody just leaves their bag everywhere. And it's strange, but you have to learn how to use freedom, how to be with freedom, and how to be free. And then after that, for her to go back to Vietnam and then to learn what Vietnam was or what Vietnam is, because when she left, it was a very it was a Vietnam on fire and a Vietnam at war. And in this book, she is lucky enough to meet foreigners who know basically her country better than she does. And I wanted to show that it's not true that when you have the face, that you have the physical traits, that you necessarily know your country not very often, but sometimes you really need a look from the outside, from someone from abroad, to appreciate what you have. And I think it's the same thing with Canada. I think Canadians are not proud enough for what they have, the purity of the country and how generous they are. So they need me to tell them that you are beautiful and you are great and we are great, and that's why I write, so that they know that I'm their mirror to say that they're great. And in Vietnam, we have all these, and there are many Swedish people, I would say, who have gone back to Vietnam to do all kinds of research and on aid programs in Vietnam. And actually, the Canadians, we have won a project against the Swedish. And I was on that project, on that Canadian project, and we were all proud that we've won against you. But it was a very interesting project. But the Swedish government, I guess, has invested a lot in helping Vietnam to become what Vietnam is today. And I'll give you just one example, and you can see how much help we need in Vietnam. To become a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organizations, you need to know the number of inhabitants in your country. And it should be very easy here to know exactly how many people are living in this country. But in Vietnam, it's very, very difficult, because during the communist years, you are not allowed to go from one house to the other without authorization. So in order to find work, you have to move to the city or you have to move to somewhere else, but always in hiding, right? And so if you ask the person how many people lives in your house, you never get the right answer. So the Vietnamese try to count the number of people in the country, and they couldn't do it. So they had to rely on the help from the outside to come in and to be objective, and so for the people to not be scared. So for just that question, we needed help from the outside. And that was the first question for the WTO. So there you go. So yeah, so there are little stories like that in V, I guess. Yeah. But she's my publisher. She likes the book, and that's normal. You don't have to like it.
Oh, you have to like it. Absolutely. Thank you very much,
Thank you
Kim.
so much.